Last week, I was in Benton County District Court representing a client who was accused of driving on a suspended license. I don't want to give his name away, we'll just call him Earl. The state's burden in a case of driving on a suspended license is exceedingly simple, as all the state has to prove is that the Department of Licensing has suspended your license and that you were driving a car. So unfortunately, the conviction comes pretty easy. In Earl's case, his license was suspended because he had got a speeding ticket about a year prior and he hadn't paid it. And the reason he didn't pay the ticket is kind of a long story and I don't need to get into it. Suffice it to say that Earl worked, despite the fact that Earl worked 2 jobs, he didn't make a lot of money at either one of them. And so Earl was poor. And so Earl pled guilty to driving while his license was suspended. And he was given a day in jail. And he was given an additional $1,000 in fines that he would have to pay on top of the original speeding ticket and on top of the $75 that the Department of Licensing was going to charge him to reinstate his license. Now, at the same time that Earl was pleading guilty to driving while his license was suspended, 2,000 miles away in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the ride-sharing company Uber was rolling out an experiment where they would make available autonomous cars, and they would drive their customers around to wherever their destinations were with these autonomous cars. And you might wonder, what does Earl have to do with Uber and their experiment in Pittsburgh? And I think it has a lot to do with each other, because I think that autonomous cars are going to completely upend our criminal justice system and have an enormous impact on individuals like Earl. So what are autonomous cars? So stated simply, an autonomous car is a vehicle that can sense its surroundings and its environment and navigate in that environment without human input. Stated simply, it's a car that drives itself. And I think that autonomous cars are going to be one of the most, if not the most, rapidly adopted technologies in the history of mankind. Now, there are people who disagree with me. Dr. Herman Herman heads up the Autonomous Car Research Lab at Carnegie Mellon University, very brilliant individual and someone who would know. And he says that the first 80% of the problems in making autonomous cars work are easy, but the last 20% are very difficult. And so he doesn't expect autonomous cars to be on the road anytime soon. Of course, there's some other very smart people who disagree with Dr. Herman. Sergey Brin, the founder of Google, has promised that Google will have autonomous cars on the road no later than 2018. Elon Musk at Tesla says that they will have autonomous Teslas on the road also no later than 2018. And both Ford and Toyota have said they will have autonomous cars, a little less aggressive schedule, on the road by 2020. Well, who's right and who's wrong in that debate? I'm not prepared to say. I'm not as smart as those guys. But what I do know is this, and that is every major technology company and every major car manufacturer is putting billions of dollars and the very best minds that they can find to work on this problem. And those minds include Dr. Herman at Carnegie Mellon University. So let's say the optimists are right. Let's imagine a world where in the near future, autonomous cars are all over the roadways. What does that world look like? Well, one thing I think we're going to see is that the price of operating a motor vehicle, especially in a ride-sharing context, is going to drop dramatically. The investment bank, Morgan Stanley, did a study, and they found that the typical car owner only drives their car about 4% of the time, which makes the entire vehicle fleet, all of our collective cars in the United States, a vastly underutilized asset. Now, automobiles are expensive. They're especially expensive if you don't drive them. But taxi cab rides and lift-sharing services like Uber and Lyft are also expensive. Of course, about 75% of the cost of a taxi or ride-sharing service is paying the driver. And while you do increase the utilization of the car, once you remove the cost of that driver, the cost becomes incredibly competitive. A Columbia University study showed that as few as 9,000 autonomous cars could replace the entire taxi cab fleet in New York City and drive the cost per mile from $4 per mile to 50 cents per mile. So a rather dramatic price reduction. And what I think that's going to do is that is going to drive the technology adoption in ways that are not typical. Typically, when new technologies come out, they're very expensive. And the first people who use them are very wealthy people because they can afford it. And then as the company gets economies of scale in their manufacturing or how they produce whatever the technology is, the prices drop and then they go out to the masses. But as I've just explained, once you combine the feature of all of that capacity utilization with getting rid of that big cost of the driver, what we should expect is that lower income people will drive the adoption of autonomous cars. Now, don't get me wrong, there'll be wealthy people who afford an autonomous car that they use for their exclusive use, but these vehicles should find themselves in widespread use because they will save low-income people money. And that brings me back to Earl. Now, a lot of people in the criminal justice system say driving is a privilege and not a right. And I think for my clients like Earl, he doesn't think about it as a privilege or a right. He thinks of it as a necessity, to get to work, to take his kids to school, to do the things he needs to do. But it's a very expensive necessity. There's a lot of regulation that goes with driving a car. You have to have a license. You have to register your car. You have to have liability insurance. You have to make sure that the car is operational, that all the lights and the signals and everything works. And for middle-class people, that's pretty trivial. We don't necessarily worry about that. But for low-income people, it can be a real problem. And one unexpected bill can knock them out of compliance, and they can find themselves like Earl in a courtroom defending a driving while their license is suspended case. But autonomous cars change all that. And they change that because that entire regulatory structure becomes superfluous. It's no longer necessary. And the reason is we have cars, we have all these rules and regulations because cars cause so much damage. 30,000 people a year die in traffic accidents, billions of dollars of damages. And so we've built this giant structure regulating them, regulating traffic laws, regulating the vehicles themselves, and enforcing that is a huge portion of our criminal justice system. Just a few examples. 40% of all interactions between police and citizens happen as a result of a traffic stop. The number of traffic stops, I think, is over 26 million per year. And 1 million of those traffic stops result in the officer actually searching the vehicle or the person or both. Now, most of the time, that's a benign interaction. But sometimes it's not. So let's give an example. There's a woman named Sandra Bland who's driving through Waller County, Texas. And Sandra was allegedly failed to signal that she was changing lanes. And she was pulled over. And a verbal altercation ensued between her and the police officer who pulled her over, which resulted in her being removed from the car, pinned down to the ground, and eventually arrested. She spent 3 days in the Waller County Jail, where she died. The coroner ruled that she had hung herself. 2 days ago, Waller County settled the civil lawsuit, the wrongful death suit against Waller County brought by the heirs of Sandra Bland for $1.9 million. This was all over a stop for failing to signal a lane change. Now, I don't think that ever should have happened under any legal regime, but whatever excuse there was because cars are dangerous that exists in a normal driving situation, it vanishes with an autonomous car. If an autonomous car doesn't signal a lane change, it's not the fault of the driver. The fault lies with the software. The driver or the passenger is simply along for the ride. So autonomous cars have the potential to break the entire rationale for the criminal justice system's regulation of automobiles and driving, and in the process, eliminate all those millions of unpleasant police-citizen interactions. Now, it doesn't have to go that way. There's a dark side to this. The widespread use of autonomous cars would theoretically give the government the ability to track in real time every man, woman, and child in the country. Certainly the cars will have the computing power, the data, and the communication software to let a central agency know where you were at all times. On the other side, autonomous cars could make travel completely regulation-free and completely anonymous. And where we're going to fall on that curve is going to depend upon policymakers. It's going to be human beings making those decisions. And so far, they've made a few. About 14 states have come out with regulations governing autonomous cars, and probably won't surprise you that the fingerprints of the big companies are on these regulations. Generally speaking, they are trying to reduce their liability. Typically, they will transfer liability from the automaker to whatever company put in the equipment to make it autonomous. Not surprisingly to me, none of these states have indicated that the passengers in autonomous cars would be free of any of the regulation that affects their normal cars. And in fact, 2 states, Florida and Nevada, have regulations that seem to say that you have to be a licensed driver to be a passenger in an autonomous car, or a driver in an autonomous car. I don't even know what a driver is in an autonomous car. So our policymakers, our politicians are going to make these decisions. And we can be sure that the Teslas and the Ubers and the Fords and the Toyotas of the world are going to be weighing in on these. And if I'm right, if these cars do become widespread, then there's 2 revolutions. The first revolution is this ubiquitous, inexpensive travel, and that's going to be a really great thing. And the second revolution is only a potential revolution, and that's the revolution where we get rid of this huge regulatory structure that governs our lives right now, and this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to get rid of it all because technology has rendered it obsolete. So I hope you will join me in pressuring our policymakers to recognize that just like you don't need a license or registration or anything to ride in the back of a taxi cab, you shouldn't need it to do it in the back of an autonomous car as well. Thank you very much.